31 days on the road. That was the assignment. I drove long haul for a refrigerated freight company out of Harrisburg, and this run was supposed to take me through Ohio, Indiana, and back down through Kentucky before I got home. 31 days. I'd done it a dozen times. I made it to day 19. The compressor on the trailer started throwing codes somewhere outside of Terre Haute. Nothing catastrophic, just enough that dispatch wouldn't let me continue with the load. Fresh produce doesn't wait on a maybe. They pulled me off the route, sent another driver from Indianapolis to pick up the trailer, and told me to deadhead the cab back to the yard. I could have stayed in a motel and waited out the paperwork. Instead, I drove home. I didn't call ahead. My wife knew the run was supposed to be another 12 days. I figured I'd surprise her, maybe take her out for dinner. We'd been rocky the past few months. Nothing I could point to exactly. Just a kind of distance that had settled in between us like weather you stopped noticing. I thought coming home early might be good for us. I pulled into our neighborhood in Mechanicsburg around 2 in the afternoon on a Tuesday. The mailbox was stuffed. I grabbed the envelopes without really looking at them and walked inside. The house was quiet. My daughter's room was empty. Not just empty, clean, like nobody had slept in it for a while. Her name was Paige. She was 15. Dark hair, her mother's eyes, a laugh that filled whatever room she was in. She'd been going through some things the past year. Some trouble at school, a falling out with her friend group, a few weeks where she barely left her room. Normal teenage stuff, I thought. I'd talked to her about it. She seemed okay. A little withdrawn, but okay. My wife's car was in the driveway. I found her in the kitchen on her phone. She looked up when I came in, and her face did something complicated. Not happy, not unhappy, just caught off guard in a way that didn't feel right. "You're home," she said. Compressor went out. "Where's Paige?" She set her phone down on the counter, face down. "She's at a program." I put the mail on the table. "What program?" "A therapeutic program. For teens." She said it evenly, like she'd rehearsed it. "I told you she needed more help than we could give her at home. She needed structure, professionals." I stood there for a second. When did this happen? 3 weeks ago. 3 weeks? I'd been on the road for 19 days, and she'd done this 16 days before I left. Or right after. I couldn't get the math to work in my head. "You didn't tell me. I tried to talk to you about it before you left. You said she was fine." I said she seemed fine. "There's a difference. Where is she? What program?" My wife walked to the counter and picked up a pamphlet. She handed it to me like she'd been waiting for me to ask. It had a picture of mountains on the front, green hills, a red barn in the distance. Clearwater Youth Academy. Empowering adolescents through purpose, structure, and accountability. There was an address at the bottom, rural Virginia, 4 hours away. I read it twice. The language was smooth and vague at the same time. The kind of brochure designed to make you feel like asking questions would mean you didn't care about your child. I'd seen enough sales material in my life to recognize the architecture of it. "How much does this cost?" she told me. I won't give the exact number, but it was more per month than our mortgage. "And you signed her up without telling me." "I signed her up because she needed help, and you were going to be gone for a month." "I have a phone, Melissa." She didn't answer that. I went to Paige's room and stood in the doorway. Her bed was made. Her posters were still on the wall. A band she liked. A print from a movie we'd seen together when she was 12. Her desk was clear except for a small succulent she'd been growing from a cutting. It was drying out. I watered it from the glass on her nightstand, and then I sat on the edge of her bed for a long time. The next morning, I got in my truck before Melissa was awake and drove to Virginia. The address from the pamphlet took me off the interstate and onto 2-lane roads that kept getting smaller. I passed a Dollar General, a grain elevator, a stretch of nothing. The GPS took me through a gate with a wooden arch, Clearwater Youth Academy in carved letters, and down a long gravel road lined with pines. There was a main building, a low cinder block structure painted white, and behind it a series of outbuildings and what looked like agricultural plots. Even from the parking lot, I could see figures in the fields. I counted at least a dozen. A woman met me at the front entrance before I could knock. Mid-40s, lanyard with a photo ID, the practiced smile of someone paid to manage situations like me. "Can I help you? I'm here to see my daughter." Paige Kellner. She was enrolled about 3 weeks ago. The smile held. "Are you on the approved visitor list, Mr. Kellner?" Her father. "Visits require advanced scheduling and approval from the primary guardian on file. We find unscheduled contact can disrupt the therapeutic process." "I'd like to see her." "I understand. If you'd like to schedule a visit, we can. I'm not scheduling anything." "She's 15 years old and I'm her father." A man appeared from somewhere behind her. Bigger, arms crossed, the posture of someone who did this regularly. He introduced himself as the program director. He had a firm handshake and the kind of confidence that comes from knowing most people back down. He walked me through the enrollment agreement my wife had signed. He said it included a provision granting the program in loco parentis authority, a legal arrangement, he explained, that allowed the staff to make decisions in the best interest of the child during the residential period. He said my wife was the primary guardian on file and that her signature was sufficient. I asked him if the children in the fields were being paid. He paused. "Work is part of the curriculum," he said. "Agricultural therapy has documented benefits for adolescent development." That's not what I asked. He said participation in the program's activities was part of the therapeutic model and was included in the enrollment fee. I asked again, "Are they being paid for their labor?" He said the conversation was getting off track and offered to have someone bring me paperwork describing the academic and therapeutic components of the program. I said I wanted to see my daughter. He said that without my wife's authorization or a court order, he couldn't allow that. I went back to my truck. I sat there for 20 minutes. Then I called a family law attorney I'd used 3 years earlier when my wife and I had briefly talked about separating. I got his voicemail. I left a message that was probably too long and not coherent enough. Then I drove back toward the main building, parked again, and this time I walked around the side. Nobody stopped me. There were staff members near some of the buildings, but they were looking at the kids, not at the perimeter. The fields behind the main structure were divided into sections. One group was pulling weeds from long rows of what looked like sweet corn. Another was moving equipment near a greenhouse, a long, low structure with clouded plastic panels, the kind that absorbs heat. It was late morning and already hot. The air around the greenhouse had that pressed-down quality, dense and still. I walked toward it. A girl near the entrance looked up when she heard my footsteps on the gravel. Then another. I scanned faces until I found her. Paige was in the third row from the end, crouched over a tray of seedlings. She was wearing a gray t-shirt and work gloves that were too big for her hands. Her hair was pulled back. She looked up, and for a second she didn't react, just stared at me like she wasn't sure I was real. Then she stood up. She crossed the row in about 4 steps, and I caught her before she could say anything. She was thinner. I noticed it when I held her, the difference in how much space she took up against my shoulder. She was shaking a little. I held on until she stopped. When she pulled back, her eyes were red and her lower lip was cracked at the corner. Not badly, but enough to notice. "Dad." Her voice came out rough. "They said you knew. They said you and Mom both signed. They said you knew where I was. I didn't know." She wiped her face with the back of her wrist. "Mom told me you agreed to it. I didn't know where you were until yesterday, Paige. I came as soon as I found out." She looked at me for a long moment. Then something in her face shifted. Not relief exactly, more like the cautious re-engagement of something she'd shut down to protect herself. "There's a boy," she said, "in the other greenhouse. He's 12. His name is Elliot. He asked me last week if somebody was going to come for him." She stopped. "He doesn't think anyone's coming." We walked out of there together. I put my hand on her shoulder and I didn't look at the staff members watching from near the main building. One of them called out something about paperwork and procedures. I kept walking. At the truck, I opened the passenger door and then turned around. The program director was coming across the parking lot. "Mr. Kellner, I have to inform you that removing your daughter from this program without proper authorization. I'm her father. She's 15. She told me she wants to leave. That's sufficient. The agreement your wife signed, my wife doesn't have unilateral authority to waive my parental rights. I've already left a message with my attorney." I got in the truck and started the engine. I'd also strongly recommend you review your labor practices before somebody asks you to do that in front of a judge. I drove Paige to a diner about 40 minutes down the road. She ate a cheeseburger and an entire order of onion rings and half of mine. We didn't talk much at first. She looked out the window. I drank bad coffee and watched her eat and tried to keep my breathing steady. She told me some of it while we were there. Not everything. She was still processing it, I could see that. But enough. She'd been woken at 5:30 every morning, work rotations before breakfast, academic instruction that amounted to worksheets, not real curriculum, phone confiscated on day one. Letters she'd written to me and to my wife were collected and, she believed, never sent. She'd asked a staff member in her second week when she could call home. The staff member told her that contact with the outside could interfere with her progress. She said the worst part wasn't the work or the heat or the food. The worst part was believing that I knew, that I'd agreed to it. I reached across the table and covered her hand with mine. I told her I was sorry I wasn't there, that I should have seen more before I left, that I wasn't going to let anything like this happen again. She didn't say anything to that. She just turned her hand over and held on. When we got home, Melissa was in the living room. She stood up when Paige walked in. For a second, nobody moved. Then, Paige walked past her and went upstairs. Melissa looked at me. I told her we needed to talk. We talked for a long time. Some of it was loud, and some of it was loud, and some of it was very quiet. I'm not going to describe all of it here. What I will say is that by the end of it, I understood something about my marriage that I'd been choosing not to understand for a while. My wife wasn't malicious. She was overwhelmed and scared about Paige, and she made a decision the way frightened people sometimes do, by paying money to a confident stranger who told her he could fix what she couldn't. But she'd also kept it from me, and she'd let Paige believe I had agreed. That part I couldn't move past as easily. My attorney called back that evening. He was careful and precise, the way he always was. He said the in loco parentis clause my wife had signed was enforceable in limited circumstances but did not override my parental rights as a co-custodial parent. He said I had strong grounds to report the program to the Virginia Department of Social Services and potentially to the Department of Education for the educational component or lack of it. He said the labor question was worth pursuing with the state labor board. I made those calls the following week. It took 2 months. That's a shorter time than you'd expect and a longer time than you'd want if your daughter was still in a place like that. Paige wasn't. She was home. But there were 17 other kids still at Clearwater when I first made those reports. The first inspection by the Department of Social Services flagged multiple issues: inadequate supervision ratios, no licensed clinical staff despite marketing language implying otherwise, and agricultural work hours inconsistent with educational programming requirements. The Labor Board had questions about compensation. The State Education Office had questions about the curriculum credentials of the so-called instructors. Clearwater Youth Academy closed its enrollment the following month. The director and 2 senior staff members faced civil action. A separate criminal inquiry was opened regarding financial fraud, specifically the representation of services that were not actually being provided. Elliot, the 12-year-old Paige had told me about, was from Tennessee. His parents had enrolled him based on a referral from a school counselor who, it later emerged, had received a placement fee from the program. He was reunited with his family within a week of my initial report. His mother called me when she found out what had happened. She cried on the phone for a long time. I didn't know what to say, so I mostly just listened. Paige started at a new school in September. It took her a while to get her footing. She was quiet in ways she hadn't been before, more careful about who she trusted. She started seeing a real therapist, a woman she actually liked, and that helped. By October, she was laughing again. Not all the time, but enough. She came and found me in the garage one Saturday afternoon when I was reorganizing the shelves. She stood in the doorway and watched me for a minute. "Dad, yeah, when the compressor broke on your truck." She paused. "Do you think that was luck or something else?" I thought about that. I'm not a particularly religious man, but I've driven enough miles to believe that some things happen for reasons that don't get explained to you right away, or maybe ever. "I don't know," I said, "but I'm glad it broke." She nodded slowly. Then she came into the garage and sat on the old cooler I've had since before she was born, and we stayed there for a while without talking, listening to the neighborhood sounds coming in through the open door. I've thought a lot since then about the gap between what these programs promise and what they actually do. They use the right words: structure, accountability, therapeutic, growth, and they put them in clean fonts on glossy paper. They charge enough that parents feel like they must be getting something real for the money. They isolate the kids from their families and then tell the kids the family agreed to it, and they tell the families the kids are making progress. And the silence in the middle is where everything happens. If your child is struggling, really struggling, I'm not telling you there's an easy answer. There isn't, but visit unannounced. Ask for credentials. Ask who is licensed and what exactly that license covers. Ask specifically whether your child can contact you at any time and what happens if they try. If any of those questions get a smooth non-answer, that's your answer. A broken compressor in Indiana brought me home 16 days early. That's the only reason I found her when I did. I think about the kids whose parents never got that call. The compressor on that trailer threw its codes on a Tuesday outside of Terre Haute, and I used to think of that as the day something went wrong. Now I think of it as the day something went right in the only way it could. There's a version of that trip where the compressor held, where I finished the run, drove back to the yard, came home on the day I was supposed to. Paige would have been there. She would have come back from Clearwater, and I never would have known exactly what happened, because the story my wife told me would have been the only story I had. Maybe I would have noticed something different about my daughter, the quietness, the careful way she started holding herself, and maybe I would have chalked it up to the program working. The way parents do when they've paid enough money to believe something must have happened. That version of things keeps me up sometimes. What I know now is that every outcome in this story was the result of a choice somebody made. My wife made a choice out of fear and exhaustion, and she compounded it by not telling me, and then compounded it further by letting Paige believe I had agreed. The people who ran Clearwater made choices every single day about how to feed those kids, how to work them, what to tell them about their families. Those weren't accidents, they were decisions. And I made choices too. I made a choice too. I made a choice when I decided Paige seemed fine before I left. I made a choice every week I was on the road and didn't push harder on the distance I could feel between me and my wife. I don't say that to beat myself up about it. I say it because understanding what I did and didn't do is the only honest way to move forward. What I've come to believe is that the clearest thing I can teach my daughter, not by telling her but by showing her, is that when something is wrong, you don't look for a way around the discomfort of it. You look straight at it. You ask the question the other person doesn't want to answer. You walk around the side of the building when they tell you to schedule an appointment. That's not recklessness, that's just refusing to be managed. Paige had more of that quality than I gave her credit for. She was 15 years old, in a place designed to make her feel forgotten, and she still looked out for a 12-year-old boy she barely knew. She asked me about Elliot before she asked me about herself. I think about that a lot. Whatever Clearwater was trying to take from her, it hadn't gotten that. The thing nobody tells you about hard situations is that they don't reveal your character. They reveal the character you've already been building, quietly, for years. Paige had been building hers in small ways I hadn't always noticed. Elliot's mother calling me from Tennessee, crying because someone she'd never met had thought to mention her son's name. She'd been building something too, a willingness to trust strangers with the worst thing that had ever happened to her, because she had no other option. I think that's what gets people through. Not luck, not the right connections, not the money to hire people who know how to extract children from places like that. Just the long, slow accumulation of small, honest choices. To pay attention, to ask questions, to keep going when the answer comes back harder than you wanted. A broken compressor in Indiana. Paige at the kitchen table in October, laughing at something on her phone. Elliot somewhere in Tennessee, probably taller now. I don't know what to call that, but I'm not going to call it an accident.